I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, today we're doing another poem in our Weird Poetry series. What could be weirder than a Scottish-style ballad written in English about the Taiping Rebellion?
I'm going to say nothing. In some ways we set the bar a little too high for ourselves with that being the first in the series, because that's pretty freaking weird. Although, I mean, if we really wanted to dig, I'm sure we could find a ton more stuff. But today's poem, I wouldn't say it's weirder, but it's a notable entry for a couple of reasons. One, and you're going to talk about this in a second because you're the one that did the translation, it's an acrostic. I only bring that term in the beginning here, ladies and gentlemen, in case you forgot. I don't know about you, Lee, but I remember writing acrostics when I was in like 5th grade or something, when they're teaching you about poetry. Yeah. It's not really the style you use if you want to be like a serious poet. That's more for kids, right? So first of all, it's an acrostic, which is weird. Second of all, it caused an enormous amount of trouble for a very powerful politician.
Yeah.
And I can't think of many cultures outside of China in which a poem could really mess up a politician's career.
Well, it didn't really mess up his career. Actually, we're kind of getting into the podcast a little too early. Let's just jump in. And is it okay if I read the poem?
Go for it, and then you can give us the background and stuff on it.
So this is the earth-shattering poem that caused so much trouble. I'm going to just translate it. The east wind flicks the face, destroying the peaches and plums. The sparrow hawk easily takes flight, its brilliant prospect spreading out before it. The bright moon shines on the ocean, a hot tear falls. The wandering man climbs the tower, contemplating the desolate city. I take a rest from this burden I have carried my whole life, a dedication to my country. The people teach me and succeed in making money. Directly following it, anger rises, shaking all of China. For now, China waits for spring in all the land.
So, the first thing I want to ask you, Lee, is if you read this, do you go, oh, wow, that's a piece of political dynamite right there?
I mean, the second stanza, and I should mention this is divided into 2 stanzas. The second stanza does seem quite political, right? Like there is clearly something going on. There's, shaking all of China. China waits for spring in the land. Something's happening politically, but it's a little unclear why this is so earth-shattering if you just read it in English. But
right. So what happens, Lee, if you read it in Chinese and pay attention to the arrangement of the characters?
So, like we said, it's an acrostic, but in Chinese, acrostics can work in a variety of different ways, so it doesn't have to have the initial letter starting out being the main thing that creates meaning. So if you read this poem in Chinese, it actually has going diagonally from right to left a phrase which states, and I'm just going to read it in Chinese really quickly, and then I'll translate it. Li Peng xia tai ping min fen. So that's Li Peng, step down, and release or lessen, lower, settle the anger of all the people. This poem, what makes this so crazy is this poem was published in the March 30th, 1991 edition of the Renmin Ribao, the People's Daily. And China is a society that has long had controls on what you can publish, particularly under the PRC, although that's been true on and off in various dynasties before that. You have this government that restricts what can be said. Poetry is a powerful voice for moral critique in China, I would say more than almost any other society that exists today. And so you can't say bad things about leaders in the official newspaper, which the People's Daily is as official as it gets. And so for this to get through the censors is huge. Now, Rob, do you remember who Li Peng is?
I do. He was one of the officials, perhaps the most notable official behind the military crackdown in Tiananmen Square in 1989.
Yeah, he's frequently called the Butcher of Beijing, although sometimes that phrase is put on Deng Xiaoping. Li Peng is the powerful official most associated with the hard line and the crackdown on students on June 4th, 1989. This poem is clearly a reference to that. It's interesting that even 2 years after the fact, you still have someone in government who's able to slip this poem into the overseas edition of the People's Daily and get it completely past the censors. Rob, what did you how do you understand this poem?
Well, I was going to ask you, because you just mentioned it was for the overseas edition. So that would be, I would assume, being read by Chinese speakers in other countries, because why would you get the overseas Renmin日报in China? So do you think it's possible that it slipped through because there's not as much censorship for Chinese speakers in other countries as there would be domestically?
Maybe, it's hard to say just because I don't know. I'm not a specialist on journalism, the history of journalism in China at that time, but it's still, I think that probably there is less of a heavy hand in the censorship in the overseas edition, but it's still fascinating that this kind of thing, I mean, it was such a big deal that actually at a press conference in 1991, Li Peng had to answer a question about it, and he essentially said, it's not that big of a deal. But of course, if a man who is the premier of China, who's one of the most important political leaders in 1991, has to answer questions about something, it is a big deal. Even if he's playing it off as if it's not a big deal, it is a big deal. And definitely the post-1989 China censorship actually the censors came down with a much stronger hand. They really cracked down hard after 1989. 1992, Deng Xiaoping goes on his famous Southern tour, and things open up a bit, though they never open back up like they did in the 1980s. This poem, for me, I wanted to do a podcast on it just because I find it so interesting. Not that it's a good poem aesthetically, but it's interesting as an artifact of the politics of the time, a kind of time capsule of Chinese censorship in 1991 and the way that people were still angry about Tiananmen, even people in the government. I when I was teaching, I taught students from the PRC who would tell me, we don't really know that much about 1989, but the government did the right thing, and that's pretty clear. That was kind of how the Baling Ho that I taught, or the Jiuling Ho. I guess I taught more Jiuling Ho. Baling Ho and Jiuling Ho are just people from the generation born in the 80s, and Jiuling Ho is people from the generation born in the 90s. The students who I taught who were born in the 90s, that they had a very vague concept of the Tiananmen Square massacre, and essentially they agreed with the government's verdict. So it's interesting to see that even at this time, after 2 years of thinking about it, but when it's still super raw, you have people in the government who are willing to risk their jobs and protest it in this most poetic way and this most Chinese way. I mean, Chinese poetry is defined by its politics. I think, Rob, when we did that Song Dynasty series, we talked about Wang Anshi and Su Shi and how important poetry was to their duel. I think Su Shi actually got banished partially because of his poems. The emperor wasn't happy about the critiques of the emperor's economic policy that Su Shi was using his poetry to critique. So again, it's fascinating to see this long tradition continuing.
And it's still there, and I find that fascinating too. Poetry, as I think we've talked about quite a few times on the podcast, undergirded the civil service exams for most of China's history. And by most of, we're talking thousands of years here, not like a a couple of decades, right? So you can't shake that. That was the way you proved you knew what you were talking about. And to some extent, it still is. I mean, there are more popular ways to make your voice heard. Internet fiction is one of them. But none of those carry any kind of weight or authority. Poetry does. Poetry, whether you're consciously doing it or not in China, draws on this very long tradition. And you see images like that in the poem. One line, I'll just read your translation. The wandering man climbs a tower, contemplating the desolate city. Every image in that line reminds me of another poem I've read. Climbing the tower, in the translation work I'm doing, I've already translated three zi poems that have this image of someone climbing a tower to gaze out over the landscape in sadness.
Super common, yeah.
Yeah, super common. Contemplating the desolate city, that's Du Fu. That's basically any poet from the Tong writing about the Anlushan rebellion. Others as well.
Poets of the end of the Southern Song when the Mongolians overtook Hangzhou use that kind of rhetoric, yeah.
Wandering man, geez, how many images can we call up there? Like I say, the stuff I'm translating now, I can probably think of a half dozen poems that had this image of someone just wandering and not knowing where they're going or wishing they could go home. That's one line. The first stanza fascinates me because it's almost like a catalog of images of things that you would expect to see in tons of poems. Peaches and plums, the east wind, the sparrowhawk, the bright moon on the ocean. I mean, it's just loaded with them. It's almost like the poet went, yes, this is an acrostic, but I want everyone to remember that what I'm calling on here is not just anger at this one politician, but the entire Chinese poetic tradition. I want the entire tradition behind me to give me weight. You know, it's all, it feels like an exercise in maybe poetic tourism or something. I wouldn't say any of those images are particularly well used.
It's almost
like he's consciously saying, hey, look, here's all the images you can think of.
It's like that chapter towards the end of Ulysses where Bloom and Stephen are in the hospital, and each section of the chapter is written in a different style of English prose going back 1,000 years up to kind of contemporary writing.
Yeah, of course. This particular poet is definitely not James Joyce. This isn't a particular,
I like the way that you're calling it kind of poetic tourism. I think that's absolutely right. This poet, and we don't know the author's name or anything else about them, they're more intent on making a political point rather than trying to create a great aesthetically pleasing poem. The peaches and plums, like the name in Chinese, Li, one of the most common surnames, Li, is actually the word for plum. So that's clearly why this poet is deploying that particular image. It's not just because, the peaches and plums, peaches go back, you're right, to the Shi Jing, the book of poetry, the earliest existing collection of poetry that we still have from Chinese literature. So we're talking about, 800, 900 BC. So clearly I think this author is trying to do this poetic tourism that you mentioned, but also there's something else going on. I mean, they're trying to make a political point, and they have to use particular words to do that.
Right, and it's fascinating because, if we're going to think of this as poetic tourism, the second stanza feels like the tour is now around communist poetry or poetry from the Maoist era, because dedication to my country, the people teach me, that alone is like, that's pretty much everything in Maoist China.
But they also succeed in making money.
Right. But this is the other reason it's interesting, is that these images are deployed and then in one or two cases sort of undermined or troubled, right? The people teach me and succeed in making money. The people aren't supposed to be able to, that's not a good communist thing, right? So is it meant to poke fun at that? Is it, what is it? What do we do? And like you say, it's not written in such a way that you go, ooh, I'm going to have to think about that. It almost just feels like a speed bump or something.
It feels like they're trying to not try very hard, I think, right?
That's a better way to put it. Yeah, exactly. I'm not trying to be deep or anything. Yeah, we kind of know that.
Rob, do you have any other thoughts before we let this poem go and bury it with Li Peng himself, who died in 2019, just before COVID began to ravage the world?
I'm just curious, and there's no way to know, this is pure speculation. If someone wrote an acrostic about Xi Jinping, what in the world would happen to him? Because, and this is why I asked this, is that 2 years after Tiananmen Square, you would assume that censorship and the crackdown were so hardcore that nothing like this could survive, right? But it did. I'm not sure you could write this today. What do you think?
I don't think you could get away with it. I think when I first got to China, I was surprised at how many gaps there were in the surveillance state. The tech just wasn't there. There was this impression in America when I got there in China in 2006 that it was this repressive surveillance state, and it certainly was repressive, but it was much less repressive than I expected. And one of the things I've noticed in my trips back to China, when I lived in China from 2006 to 2007, 2009 to 2010, and went back in 2014 and 2018 for a period of 1 or 2 months. Increasingly, you see the state getting better at repression. It's not that need to repress was not there. It's just that the tech got much, much better. And so the tech matched up with the intent. I think that this kind of poem wouldn't get very far in today's China in 2022, just because the tech is so good at stopping it. I mean, obviously someone could write this, but it would not circulate very far. I think
certainly not an acrostic. Certainly not an acrostic. Yeah, I think you're. I think an algorithm would absolutely pick up something like Xi Jinping step down and assuage the people's grief or something like that.
Although, I mean, we've got to remember. I mean, I think a little more than a decade ago, you had the Hexie, the river crabs, and the Caonima, which was the grass mud horse, but it was also it means something else in China, which we can't repeat on this podcast. It's something that one would suggest that you do to your mother, and that kind of escaped censors. I think, though, that in the decade since then, the censorship just has gotten more dialed in. It's more on point. Right. But stuff does get through. So, yeah. But anyway, dear listener, check out the translation, because we're going to put it on the website. We'll put the original and the translation on the website.
And make sure you read the Chinese, or at least look at the Chinese. I think, Lee, you're going to still include your version with the acrostic section bolded so people can see how it looks, because the visual is pretty important.
Yeah, I think I'll put a photo of the original publication up.
That's probably a good idea. So as we're wrapping up here, social media stuff: Twitter, ChenLitPod, Patreon, Chinese Literature Podcast, and Chinese Literature Podcast at gmail.com.
Send us emails. We love emails.
Anything else, people? Contact us. Chat with us. Tell us how amazing we are.
How amazing you are, Rob.
Well, I'd settle for that. That's fine.
All right. Well, let's bury this poem at Babaoshan Cemetery, where Li Peng is buried, and let's salute the great revolutionary Li Peng and the great revolutionaries Rob Moore and Lee Moore.
Let's do it.
I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.